Happy Friday, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We're going to have a very fun show today. Very interesting look at some of the things that Kirby Smart said last night up at the start of UGA practices, which he did confirm will be on Monday. We'll deal with that on today's show. It's Jeff Sintel coming up on the road, presented by AAA with him. A lot of UGA recruiting updates to get into in terms of commitments that we know are about to come that may or may not involve UGA. Rumors of possible commitments that could involve UGA. We will cover all of that with Jeff Sintel. There's also the bad news out there. UGAsports.com first to report that Keely Ringo has sustained an injury. We will kind of deal with that on today's show. We'll do our due diligence on that. But in and around that, we'll certainly have as much fun as we can. Good way to close out the week. Glad to have you with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Kroger. And it gets ready to begin. Connor's ready right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger. Fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I heard something yesterday that was music to my ears. I'm about to play it for you, and I dare say it'll be music to your ears, too. And you find yourself once again having to give the same caveat that we give a lot. There's obviously still so much about the viability of the upcoming season that we don't yet know for sure. I've said a million times, I am not football at all costs. I do believe there is a cost not to playing football that could also involve the health and safety of the student athletes that play the game. But one way or another, this is not one of those things where around here we have totally disregarded the coronavirus. We just believe there could be a healthy and safe way to play this sport in the midst of the coronavirus. And I don't apologize for feeling that way. I think we've backed up our feeling on that with the evidence supported by people who are far smarter than me. But beyond that, sometimes you just kind of want to talk about football, right? And you just kind of want to put the coronavirus aside for a moment and say, let's just deal with that 10 minutes from now or on a different show or some other time. Can we just for a moment deal with what it is we all love about college football, the fact that it's an incredibly fun thing to follow. If you're a UGA fan, it's incredibly fun to have a team you like cheering for. Getting deep in the storylines involving UGA, there is just a ton of very rich plot lines that could come into play for the Dogs this upcoming season. Can we just appreciate that for a moment? Well, if you're the kind of person that wants to do that, today is your day here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, because last night Kirby Smart made an appearance on a 680 The Fan show. 680 The Fan is an Atlanta sports radio station, and some of this was related to his support for high school football in the state of Georgia, and some of this was in discussing how the recruiting process has been impacted by the coronavirus. You can read some of that from Jeff Sintel at DawgNation.com. But near the very end of that discussion on the Atlanta radio station last night, Kirby Smart also got into a confirmation of the fact that practice will take place this upcoming fall, or excuse me, the practice is about to begin for Georgia, and some energy from Smart about what it is that he's looking forward to seeing once that takes place. So this is football talk from Kirby Smart. We haven't heard much from Smart over the course of the last few months, but we're on the verge of the start of UGA practices, and here is what Smart thinks about his team, and here is what Smart is looking forward to. Here's the UGA coach from 680 The Fan.
Our expectation is always the same, to get the most out of this team that we possibly can. And I really don't know what that is yet. I don't know those possibilities. You know, we got unknowns at some positions and got some talented competitions that I'm excited about. I mean, we've been able to have some of this little mini camp time. We're going to have some hellified competitions at some positions, and we got some good, talented young players that are going to help our roster.
Boy, don't you love the idea of that, the phrasing of Kirby Smart there, the hellified competition. I mean, isn't that just kind of a fun way to say that? And listen, around here on a show like this, when it comes to these hellified competitions, the ones that are going to be waged for playing time, for starting jobs and everything else, there are some that just kind of naturally draw more attention than others do. For instance, we talked about Jamie Newman on the show yesterday. I dare say we've probably talked about Jamie Newman a couple of thousand times over the course of the last few months, but he's involved in an intense competition. JT Daniels, the recent USC transfer, is a part of that. Dwan Mathis, who's now fully healthy, he's a part of that. Carson Beck, the incoming freshman, he's a part of that. Stetson Bennett still in the mix there, too. Quarterback competition is something we talk a lot about. There is no shortage of headlines and space on shows like this devoted to that topic. Kind of the same way for running back, too. there's a general belief that Zamir White's probably the top incoming running back to start the season for Georgia this year, just for a number of reasons. But Georgia is a team that traditionally uses multiple running backs, that if Zamir White gets his share of carries, there is still plenty to go around for other backs. Will it be the freshman Kendall Milton? I certainly think he has a chance to be a big part of this. Is it a big-time year for James Cook, someone who's been kind of waiting the wings? There are people who want to see more from Kenny McIntosh, and at a place like Georgia that is, I think, rightly regarded in many circles as tailback U, the competition for what's going to happen at running back is also the kind of thing that generates a lot of headlines. There's a lot of interest. If you're hanging out with Georgia fans, socially distant, of course, these days, but if you're hanging out with UGA fans, that's the kind of thing that you're going to also spend a good bit of time talking about. Curiosity with the wide receiver position. As we said before, we know that George Pickens is, to start the season, Georgia's top receiver. He's among the top receivers in the entire country. But you got to have a lot more receivers than that. Is it a healthy Dominic Blaylock? Is it an influx of freshman talent like Marcus Roseme, Jermaine Burton? Is it guys who've been here now ready to thrive in a Todd Monken offense like Demetrius Robertson or Kearis Jackson? Wide receiver is a natural source of curiosity and an easy way to get a lot of attention on your online product if you're in the business of covering UGA football. However, and I made this case yesterday on our Cover 4 Live broadcast brought to you by Georgia Farm Bureau, that while quarterback may be a naturally more interesting question in terms of the hellified competition that's going to go on there, and running back may be kind of naturally the thing that Georgia fans gravitate towards, and there's still a hellified competition there at that spot. Wide receiver very much the same way. Ultimately, my big, to use Smart's word again, hellified competition, the one that I'm leaning in on the most in terms of how it determines the overall fate for Georgia football this season, for me, it's what's going to happen at right tackle. And I'm basing that on a couple of assumptions here. I'm going to assume for a moment that Jamari Salyer starts at left tackle. Now, my assumptions are wrong all the time. Maybe this one ends up being wrong, but Salyer seems to be growing into a leadership role with Georgia. If there was a normal SEC media days in a year like this, I believe that Salyer would have been pegged as the offensive representative to go speak for Georgia. I just think that even though he hasn't been a full-time starter before, he is, I think, in the role of vocal leader for the Georgia offense right now. So if you trust him in that regard, you probably trust him at the offensive line, what we think of as the most important position there at the left tackle spot. My guess is that Salyer probably does that. I think there's competition at guard. We may see multiple guys play at guard over the course of the early stage of the season, but if I had to guess, I believe that Justin Schaefer's a starter for you at left guard, and I believe that Ben Cleveland's probably a starter for you at right guard. That's the assumption I'm going to make, even though those guys were going to get competition from a Warren Erickson, who started in the Sugar Bowl, from incoming, freshman guys like Cedric Von Pran and others. I still would say that Schaefer and Cleveland as the most likely starters there in that spot, and I don't think anyone can do anything to move Trey Hill out of the center position. So there's 4 starting spots that if I had to bet you a sawbuck or something like that, what is a sawbuck? Is sawbuck $10? Actually, I'm not betting you $10 on anything. Maybe I'll bet you $1 or $5. But if I had to bet you a couple dollars on something, I might say those 4 offensive line spots I feel pretty good about. The right tackle spot, I don't know what's going to happen here. And the reason why, for me, the hellified competition at right tackle, even though it's not headline-generating news the way that quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers would be, even though for me it's much more important in terms of the overall fate for this team, I've pegged Jamie Newman to be the starting quarterback, but if I'm wrong and it ends up being JT Daniels, in my mind, the number 2 option there is still a pretty good option, right? JT Daniels was a starter at USC. How big is the drop-off from one to the other? It might not be that great. I just mentioned a handful of potential running backs, but all of them have their fans within DawgNation. All of them have guys touting each of these running backs. Cook, McIntosh, Milton, even Dejon Edwards. All of these backs have people touting them to potentially be very, very good. So whichever 2 emerge in the primary positions and whichever one of those guys ends up being the third option, you could still be in really good shape no matter what the overall pecking order between those guys is, and potentially a similar case could be made for the wide receiver position. And obviously the defense is fairly well solidified, even if it's playing a lot of different guys throughout the course of the season. But right tackle is one of those things where, unfortunately, right now, not only do you not know who the starter is going to be, you have good options. Maybe it's Xavier Truss, maybe it's a Warren McClendon, maybe it's incoming freshman like Broderick Jones, assuming he's healthy. You have a lot of these options at your disposal, but in addition to not really knowing who the starter is supposed to be, you're not really yet sure if your number 2 option is someone that generates as much confidence as the number 2 or 3 option at running back would. The number 2 or number 3 option at wide receiver possibly could, even though that was an underperforming position group a year ago. Same thing, quarterback, running back, wide receiver across the board. Those secondary options, that third option, you might have some sense of what you're getting there. But we haven't seen much of Truss, no fault of his own. We haven't seen much of McClendon, no fault of his own. Broderick Jones is stepping in as a freshman, and Connor Riley wrote about this. Even though we saw Andrew Thomas pass that test as a freshman starter at right tackle with flying colors, for the most part in the SEC, the tackle spot has not necessarily been fertile soil for starting freshmen at the tackle position. So for me, if you're looking for hellified competition, that's where you look to see it go down, at that right tackle spot. And who emerges from there? Boy, that changes the overall story from Georgia in a very big way. Let me do one more thing, though, to kind of, put some sort of facts behind some opinions in all of this and kind of keep the theme going of fun day to be here on DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger, because we've got real football to talk about. We said on the show yesterday, well, I guess the Georgia practices, they're supposed to start on Monday. It seems so weird because of all the other talk that's out there, but Kirby Smart did confirm that for us on 680 The Fan last night of exactly what the first few days of the Georgia camp's going to be like, and the fact that it does begin to start the new week. Here's Kirby again.
We should be Monday, Tuesday, helmets only. Wednesday, pads, which is for us, shoulder pads and shorts. And then we'll have another day of shoulder pads and shorts. And our 5th day under NCAA rules allows us to put full pads on. And I think that'll end up being the following week. But we'll be in pads next week, yes.
So listen, I take that as really good news. And we got a long way to go before we actually get this team or any of the SEC teams on the field playing this season. But I would say that the smart people are doing what they can to make sure that happens. And below that, the coaches got a job to do, get their team ready. Kirby Smart seems very ready to do that job. And the results, once we see games, hopefully starting in September, that'll be for all of the fans to enjoy. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Kroger. For the folks live on video, we'll give you a little bit of breaking news, and we'll talk more to Jeff Sintel about this in a moment as we go on the road, presented by AAA. But Malcolm Johnson, the 4-star wide receiver, has made his commitment decision. He's going to Auburn. Generally speaking, I guess that's where I thought he was kind of going anyway. I don't think this is a huge surprise. I don't really think anyone who's all that plugged into UGA recruiting thought that Johnson was going to Georgia. I guess Johnson was one of his 3 finalists. I guess Georgia was one of Johnson's 3 finalists, but ultimately he makes the decision to go to Auburn. We'll talk more to Jeff Sintel about that coming up in just a moment. Of course, our show today, all made possible by our friends at Kroger. And, listen, I got 2 kids. They're both in public school, public education, and really all forms of education, private education too. But, it's just really important to me, right? Because I know the impact the schools can make in the lives of the students. And the one thing I know is it's the teachers at those schools that make all of this possible. They are very important cogs in our society. A year like this proves that as much as anything ever could. I love the way, with all that in mind, that Kroger's doing a whole bunch to support teachers right now. Every Wednesday, it's great savings. You can show up at Kroger on Wednesday if you're a teacher, and 10% you can save on school supplies, toys, electronics, and apparel. What a great thing from Kroger. It's every Wednesday right now for teachers, so we have a lot of teachers who are listening to us. Some of you, are at work during the day. You listen to DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger On Demand. Jot this down. Remember that. On Wednesdays at Kroger, take advantage of big 10% savings there on a whole bunch of items. All right, as I said before, we're going to get Jeff Sintel in a moment. We'll talk to him about Johnson, the other stuff involving UGA recruiting. We'll do all of that. Let me, though, before we get to that, deal with, and this is hopefully the only bad news that we'll do on the show all day long today. You can go to DawgNation.com and read more about this. UGAsports.com, the first to report that Keely Ringo has sustained an injury that's going to keep him out here for a bit. He'll be recovering from surgery. Ringo did put something out on social media, a cryptic message that most assume was kind of about this and related to this. Let me show you what Ringo himself said, trying to keep a good idea on all of this, good attitude on all this. He says, blessing in disguise, gives you the prayer hands emoji. And obviously Ringo was one of those guys that when you finally get a chance to see him in a Georgia uniform, there is just going to be so much excitement because of all the guys that you maybe went back and looked at from the class of 2020, their film. And I'm not going to pretend to be X's and O's film breakdown guy. That's not really the badge I'm trying to wear here around DawgNation. But there are some guys who you don't have to have film breakdown expertise to really see in action. Ringo's one of those guys. he's one of the most dazzling athletes that you would ever see and could ever see. And so a little bit of a health setback for Ringo is obviously a disappointment. Georgia is still incredibly deep when it comes to the defensive secondary. It's going to be hard to crack a starting lineup for Ringo anyway. Stokes is already there, Eric Stokes. He's obviously a very important veteran. I think Tyson Campbell, after dealing with his own health situation a good bit last year, my assumption is he slides back in and he's a starter, primary starter at one of the cornerback spots this year. But DJ Daniels played a lot. Tyreek Stevenson, as Jeff Sintel mentioned on our Cover 4 Live, brought to you by Georgia Farm Bureau yesterday, he thinks it's a big leap year for Tyreek Stevenson. So it's in the midst of all of this that Ringo is fighting for playing time as it is. And yet ultimately, it doesn't make you feel any better about Ringo's apparent setback here, the fact that Georgia's already deep in the secondary, because there are people who wanted to see Ringo in addition to those other guys that Georgia had there. That time is going to come for Keeley, but it sounds like it's going to be a few weeks. You can read more about that at DawgNation.com. A little bit of a setback for Ringo from a health standpoint. Apparently, UGAsports.com is the first to report. It sounds like Ringo, at least on his social media, is in good spirits about this, and we will continue to wish him well. It's DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. We're not done today hearing from Georgia coach Kirby Smart. He also said something on 680 The Fan last night that was very interesting about the upcoming game that Georgia has at some point this season at Alabama. It was originally scheduled for September. Will it still be at that time? We'll find out more on that in the days to come, but we'll hear from Smart on the Bama game a little bit later on. Also, Georgia recruiting, a lot out there, a lot going on. Rumors of some possible good news here this weekend and a whole bunch more. Let's cover all of that as we go on the road, presented by AAA with Jeff Sintel.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We'll say hello to Jeff Sintel here. It's On the Road, assisted today by AAA. A lot of recruiting stuff to get into with Jeff Sintel. Jeff, we appreciate your time here on this Friday morning. Hope you're doing well. There's a sense of optimism in the air with Kirby Smart talking about the start of Georgia preseason camp on Monday, and we'll see if we can kind of keep some of that kind of stuff going with UGA recruiting. What do you say about that?
Hey, man, that sounds great. You got, 4 days of acclimation, 3 days until you get in shells, and then on the fifth day, which will probably be the following week, sounds like Kirby's going to put those Bulldogs in full pads, man. Isn't that just, wonderful to hear, Brandon?
It is very wonderful to hear. I love the idea of it. I can't wait to hear how all this goes for Georgia practice. I kind of gave some of my thoughts before you joined us about how I think some of these competitions, could possibly play out and why some for UGA really matters. But just the notion of real football news again is going to be a very soothing thing for a lot of people. Let me begin with this, though, on the recruiting front, if you don't mind, here on the road, assisted by AAA. There was an interesting tweet from Georgia defensive back commit David Daniel about some possible news coming, and he references Hayes Fawcett. And now Hayes Fawcett's one of those guys, to a certain portion of our audience, is very famous, and to another portion of our audience, they've never heard of him at all. But Fawcett is a guy that makes the social media edits that a lot of UGA recruits share. And Fawcett, in fact, I think we'll show this to our audience here, give folks a chance to see this. But what Fawcett says on Twitter is, tomorrow's going to be a huge day. Now, he said this yesterday. Tomorrow's going to be a huge day for recruiting. Wow, you heard it here first. And then David Daniel comes in with that UGA commit graphic, mentioning the idea that UGA might have some good news. And stuff like that gets some folks' attention here. Now, Malcolm Johnson is not the answer to this, because Johnson has committed to Auburn. We'll get more into Georgia's wide receiver recruitment here in a moment. But is Daniel hinting at the possibility of some good news for UGA at some point in time on the recruiting scene here?
Well, Brennan, I think you'd be very disappointed if he was referencing an edit of all the current Georgia commitments together, just showing off the current public members of the class. I think, a little backstory. I want to make sure people give props here to Mr. Fawcett. I think Hayes Fawcett is going to make a lot of folks feel really old. I think he's a college freshman right now, and he's been, according to my count, been like the go-to national edit guy for about 4 or 5 years now. He was doing that in high school with just about every big name you can think of, and he's still very active doing that now with multiple edits, multiple commitments. I think a young man out of Georgia, tied in out of Westminster, who committed to Penn State yesterday in the 2022 class, That was a Hayes Fawcett edit as well. He's definitely thriving in that lane, to say the least. And you see those hints there, and we all do know David Daniel as one of the most plugged in and the senior statesman, let's say, on social media of the Georgia 2021 class.
So we will see if Georgia fans need to be on pins and needles about something related to that. We'll keep our eye on all of that. The name we know that's not going to be a part of this, although no one really expected that to be true anyway. The name we know that's not going to be a part of that is the four-star wide receiver Malcolm Johnson, who did announce his pledge to Auburn just a few moments ago as we're recording this here on a Friday morning. Johnson, I'm also being told, has reclassified himself now as a 2020 prospect, as some others have already done here in this recruiting cycle, just given the unknown scenario involving high school football in various states. So Johnson off the board as expected, but it kind of reinvigorates a question, Jeff, that we've talked about a number of times around here, which is, what are Georgia's wide receiver priorities? You know, at one point in time, I thought it'd be a Deion Colsey, but you never really hear much about the Athens area prospect and UGA. Jaden Thomas from Pace Academy is a guy that I thought we'd be talking more about, but we haven't done as much of that as maybe I thought we would. I honestly can say I have no idea the direction that Georgia's leaning in with wide receivers. I have seen other receivers go other places, but I'm not really quite sure to know who among the available prospects that's left Georgia values over others. On a day in which a wide receiver has also chosen to go elsewhere, what is Georgia really looking to get done with its wide receiver room here in the 2021 class?
Well, Brendan, I think you've seen a lot of things that we just need to just chronicle really fast. Number one is Georgia's new offense. Folks want to see it. They didn't see the spring. Number two is Georgia definitely scattered, smothered, covered, cap, chunked, diced, and loaded their wide receiver room last year with, I think, 3 or 4 guys that look like, future NFL players if they stay healthy. The other thing you got to think about is Georgia's looking for a specific type of wide receiver. If we look through the trends, if we look through the biggest of the targets there, we see, remember Mario Williams, who commits to Oklahoma, shifty, speedy, the type of guy that could make an elephant miss in a bathtub, the guys that are very quick and get instant separation on anyone. That's what Malcolm Johnson Jr. was. Now, he's a raw prospect, but he's another fast speed demon burner like Anthony Schwartz they got out of American Heritage a couple of cycles ago, but unfortunately Auburn didn't really use Schwartz that well. I think he had 40 catches for 400 yards and 10 yards per catch and 1 touchdown a year ago. But that's the promise of Auburn wanting to put a lot of speed on the field. Malcolm Johnson was a 10.5, 10.4, 10.3 type guy in the 100. He's ran a confirmed earlier this year, 6.26 in the 60. You start thinking about other names. And, Brandon, I think that's the thing they're looking for. A lot of those names that are maybe closer to Georgia's, wheelhouse in terms of location, they're just not that blistering fast guy. They're more of that all-around type receiver that does a lot of things well, but they don't have that electric lightning burst in and out of breaks. And I know, Brandon, if I know you well, man, unless you've totally changed from the dude we were talking to cover 4 on now, I'm going to say a name, and I don't want you to say, now, Jeff, why do we have to go kicking up dust at Florida again, man? But to me, I think the wide receiver recruit that's left on the board that Georgia will really go after and put a lot of traction into still, even with all these committed guys, I think that's Marcus Burke, the committed speedster that's currently committed to Florida. I know you'd hate that, Brandon, to see Georgia take some of Florida's lunch money again on their recruiting trail, but that's a name that I think if Georgia's looking for a second receiver, remember, Georgia really doesn't need to reach at receiver after what they did a year ago. And I know that's kind of maybe puzzling for folks that go 5-star quarterback, number 2 quarterback in the class. We got to get some really tremendous wide receivers to pair up with him in his recruiting class. Well, I just think a lot of when you look at the Georgia 2020 haul, I think there's going to be redshirt candidates. Remember, 4 games. I don't even know how the redshirt thing is going to work yet, Brandon. If you've heard about it, I'd love to see if you've heard it. But how would the redshirt rule work when you only get 4 games in the 10-game season? I think it would still apply, even though that the math and the ratio is not quite equitable there, where you could play in 40% of the season and the regular season games and still get a red shirt. I think that's the names to look for now. I think Georgia would probably, to get that second guy along with Mitchell in the 2021 class, I think what Georgia would like to do would be flip somebody currently committed to another school. And I think the top target there would likely be Marcus Burke.
So I've already said I'm in a great mood today, and I think there's a lot of positive news to cover in today's show. I guess the one thing that I'll say that potentially leans in a negative direction is it seems pretty obvious to me on the basis of the 2021 wide receiver recruitment. This is not to disparage anyone who eventually signs with Georgia at that position, but Georgia clearly sold this is how bad we need you for the 2020 class, opportunity for early playing time, because Georgia had some big holes in the receiver spot. The on-field production for the group in 2019 just wasn't very good. But after a very big class of receivers for the class of 2020, without results to sell, it looks like the receiver spot is just kind of falling on, some recruiting challenges, that Georgia needs receivers in the offense to play well to convince top-flight receivers to be a part of this program. That just seems obvious to me when you look and see how all this is going at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, I think that's a position, Brandon, where it's not just receivers playing well. It's the ratio of how well Georgia's going to throw it and what Monken's offense will look like. Personally, I feel like the 2020 recruiting cycle at the wide receiver position is no longer, to me, has not been replenish, refill, reload, amplify, augment what you already have in the room. I think that is a very strong NFL caliber room with a lot of dudes. But you're right, Brandon. The wide receiver position at Georgia didn't need additional obstacles or hindrances to make it even harder to recruit the elite guys to Georgia. But I think when a lot of folks see Marcus Roseney, they see Arian Smith and Jermaine Burton, guys like that, especially Justin Robinson. Let's not forget him. I think he gets forgotten all too much. Where if we had to refigure our own rankings for the Georgia receivers that came into the class in 2020, I think Justin Robinson for me might be number one or number two, and that's saying quite a lot. I think if you can get Georgia's receiver room with those 2020 signees and get a guy who looks like a Blaylock in his first year and a guy that looks like a Pickens in his first year, except for maybe the Baylor game, I think if you get two guys like that out of the 2020 haul, I think it takes a lot less pressure on the 2021 class to get more dudes.
Hey, I want to ask you about running back recruitment here in a moment, but here on the road, assisted by AAA with Jeff Sintel, let me talk about my friends at AAA just for a moment. I've been a AAA member for a long time. My entire family has been. It just gives us peace of mind when we're on the road or when maybe I'm away from my wife and she's on the road with my kids. The idea of them having car trouble, something like that, it's not something I enjoy thinking about. But with AAA, I know that if that does happen, flat tire or something else, I know they're going to be well taken care of and they'll be back on their way again really soon. It's just part of the peace of mind you get when you and your family become AAA members. But in addition to that, you can also have other benefits associated with AAA that you might not even be aware of, that you can start saving on your auto insurance when you switch to AAA today. Let me give you an idea. You can save up to an average of $529. That's right, save an average of $529 when you switch your auto insurance to AAA. Website to go to find out more about this is AAA.com/auto insurance. That's AAA.com/auto insurance, and you can be in a really good shape with that when it comes to AAA. All right, so Jeff, there was obviously the news of the last few days involving the Big Ten's decision to postpone its season. Some people would say that's the right thing to do, that the Big Ten is valuing the health and safety of their players. Other people would say that the Big Ten maybe didn't try as hard as it could to have a season, and other leagues, including the SEC, would seem to be more committed to what the players say they want, which is a chance to play this upcoming season. No matter which side of this ultimately people fall on is ultimately not important to me. What does matter in the question I'm asking right now is, for a guy like Travion Henderson, a running back commit to Ohio State, or a guy like Donovan Edwards, who is kind of thought to be certainly in the mix for Michigan, do you foresee the Big Ten situation, the absence of a season this fall, the uncertainty of when the Big Ten will play again, and the distraction of the recruiting process that comes just from a completely changed football calendar, does this impact UGA recruiting, and does it make it easier to win with a guy like Edwards, or maybe get involved in a flip for a guy like Henderson? Can this be to Georgia's advantage?
Well, I think you got to remember here, and I know running backs are near and dear to everyone's heart, but you got to remember, I look at Henderson. And Henderson was a guy that committed to Ohio State having never set foot on the campus. And he did set foot on the Georgia campus during his recruiting. Something to consider. And, Brendan, I think the one thing that the Big Ten schools are going to try to do, especially with a lot of their early enrollees, is they're going to sell and sell and sell. And what they're going to try to do is say, listen, your situation hasn't changed at all. It's actually morphed into a way where you're going to get on the field and get the chance to play for Ohio State a lot sooner than you expected. Instead of going through spring practice and a spring game, now you're going to get to play spring, real, actual games and start developing. So for a lot of those guys that were already considering a Big Ten school and were going to enroll early or not going to enroll early, their situation currently hasn't changed a lot yet. And I think Henderson, given that he commits to a school without ever visiting it, had some very strong ties there, and we'll have to wait and see whether that gives him a lot of pause. I think maybe the greater chance right now is for a guy like Donovan Edwards, who was waiting to make his decision with some strong feelings and leans towards home state Michigan and other schools. You hear a lot about Oklahoma with him there as well, and Oklahoma is a school that's still thriving and still playing its schedules as well. So I think Edwards is a guy that was currently uncommitted as well, and I think that's going to certainly give him reason to just keep waiting and kind of double down on what he was already feeling about the 2021 cycle and just wanting to get those visits. And as we learned earlier this week, that visits are now postponed until at least October the 1st, which the optimist in me, Brendan, who's always looking for good news, will say, oh, that's great. They're just going to align it with the start of the SEC schedule, so that will work out perfectly.
Yeah, there you go. I like that. Let me try to cover some more ground in the time that we have remaining. You wrote the other day at DawgNation.com about 2022 quarterback Gunnar Stockton, now down to 2 finalists, South Carolina. He's got a lot of family connections to that program. Or Georgia, who we would, I guess, assume has been in on that recruitment now for a while. But that's not the only elite 2022 quarterback. MJ Morris has also recently made some news, confirming some rumors that have been on the internet for a while, that he was leaving Carrollton High School, going to Pace Academy. Jeff Pace is a school that Georgia's recruited really well, especially the offensive line spot. Andrew Thomas, Jamari Salyer, Trey Blunt, a receiver on the Georgia roster as well, also from Pace Academy. So it would stand to reason that MJ Morris being at Pace Academy is at least not a bad thing for that recruitment. But the one thing I still don't know is, who's the priority here for 2022? Is it MJ Morris? Is it Gunnar Stockton? Do we know yet?
Yeah, Brendan, I don't know if Georgia's in a position anymore with quarterback recruiting. I don't know if you've noticed, but they've got 1 or 2 arms in Athens now that might have some eligibility going forward. Maybe just might be able to spin that pigskin a quarter mile. But I think Georgia's in the point right now where I don't think they need to say, kind of like with Caleb Williams and Brock Vandegrift, how things have changed since this past January, where we love you both, we want you both, first one in is in, and we're going to go on down the road and be gleefully happy with our quarterback. I don't know if Georgia needs to do that or even wants to do that now anymore with what it's looking at in 2020. I think it's got its eyes on maybe a preference guy, and I think that they're trying to figure out the timeline where it makes sense for both parties. It's intriguing, though, Brendan, because you've got Stockton, a lot of coaches in the state. I talked to a lot of high school football coaches in the state, and I would say most of the state of Georgia's high school association still favors Stockton a little bit more. I don't know whether that's because he's the son of a coach or because he's put so much game film, and the number is 113 touchdowns through 2 seasons of high school ball. He's actually on a more prolific pace right now than Trevor Lawrence was early in his career at Cartersville, which is another, man, that's saying a ton right there. But the thing with Morris that is intriguing is he's a dual threat. These guys are both dual threats. They're both 4.7 or better on the track or in the laser, so they're going to be that mobile quarterback Georgia's looking for in the future. But the thing with Morris is he didn't play all of last year at full health, and he didn't have a full season where he was the guy, or 2 full seasons where he was the guy, like young Stockton has had to do at Reagan County. So there's a sense with a lot of people that, Gunnar Stockton may only get 10, 15% better than what we see now over the next 3 or 4 years. Whereas there's the sense with M.J. Morris that he might get considerably better. Man, what he's going to have at pace this fall, Brandon. I see a lot of excellent young receivers in the 2022, the 2023 class. They've already got 4-star wide receiver Jaden Thomas, as you mentioned earlier, who has Georgia in his top 5, final 5, along with Michigan, Notre Dame, Arkansas, Penn State. This is a year where M.J. Morris can put up one of those 4,000-yard seasons, and that, especially in Double-A ball, and the kind of seasons that young Stockton has put together for Raven County as well. And that's going to be something to watch this year as both of them get the chance to play high school football in the state of Georgia. I don't know if you saw earlier this week, Brandon, it was kind of troubling to me to see the state of North Carolina really close to Georgia in the Deep South SEC footprint. North Carolina has announced this week that they're shifting their high school season, I believe, from February to April, making that move, which they feel is the best for the young people of their state.
Yeah, that's certainly news that a lot of folks notice and certainly continue to be worth following. Brock Bowers commits, the 4-star tight end. We've had our say on that on the show. What was your reaction? Not unexpected news, but boy, Bowers represents someone that I think could really be a weapon for this UGA offense in future years. I'm assuming you agree with that.
I think he's going to be dynamic, Brandon. I think, if someone wants to say, and I'm going to just be clear, Bowers is as fast as some of these guys that keeps getting mentioned on the receiver board for Georgia. That's how fast he is. And I think everybody, let me clear up a misconception about Bowers. Everybody thinks that he's going to be, he's not quite 6'4", and everybody thinks, he's already 235, 240 in high school, and he's going to be 250 in college. Folks, that's not the plan for Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is expected to be a matchup nightmare that could play all across the formation. He could play some outside receiver. He could be a hybrid. I think where Brock, from knowing him pretty well and talking to him a lot, he wants to be around 6'3.5" and about 230 in college. And he wants to be a guy that is going to be very tough to deal with for linebackers and safeties in Todd Monken's schemes. And Brock is a 4.33 GPA. He's crazy in the classroom. I love it that we got a chance to go beyond the stars this week with Bowers, and not just the recruiting story and the rankings and where he fits and how he ranks nationally and what his 40 times are. The 40 is a laser 4.5. He did that before his junior season. He has a 40-inch vertical. Brandon, Georgia doesn't have guys like that. This will not be a hand-in-the-ground guy for most of the time, although he can do that. I think of what his 7-on-7 coach told me. He's a guy that won't complain. He's a guy that won't chirp. He's just going to go about his business and do his work. And he compared him to a 1980s tight end. He called him a throwback jewel because of his mindset, the way he just goes about his business. He worked hard. He's not going to complain about getting the ball, but when you throw the ball his way, he's going to make plays and get touchdowns out of it. And I thought the edit from Todd Hartley that was created by that, the gurus on the Georgia digital design staff for football, of Barry Bonds launching one deep into the bay, I think that was tremendously appropriate because I think Brock Bowers is a name that, used appropriately in this offense, he's not going to be a guy you look at that has 11 catches in a season. That's not the type of player Brock Bowers is. Very
quickly, before we let you go, I mentioned David Daniel earlier. One of the guys that Daniel has retweeted a good bit lately is Terrion Arnold, who you also wrote about at DawgNation.com. And the most fascinating aspect of the Arnold story for me is the personal involvement that Kirby Smart has seemed to take in this recruitment. And according to Arnold, has had some very complimentary things to say about Arnold. This would seem to be a player worth watching here for the class of 2021.
Dynamic, Brandon. As a reporter, we're trained to be naturally curious, but also naturally skeptical. And when I hear folks, Terrion said that Miami's recruiters bring up Sean Taylor, LSU's recruiters bring up Derek Stingley, Cam Newton thinks he's special. The Cam Newton 7-on-7 team puts him up there with Smoke Monday and Richard LeCount III as the best DBs they've ever had. He got to play with David Daniel there a little bit this early winter before the pandemic shut everything down. There's something that's different about Terrion Arnold for me, Brandon, is Arnold says he talks to Kirby Smart 2 or 3 times a week. That's not including the texts. And that Kirby Smart is talking to him now. He's developing him. He's coaching him. That is a strong relationship where Arnold even told me he doesn't talk to any head coach as much as he does Kirby Smart. And this was the thing that really hooked me on. I wrote a really long story about him because I think this was a guy that folks needed to learn the whole A to Z about. Kirby told him that he sees him as a Jim Thorpe Award winner and the type of defensive player that can get into the downtown athletic club for the Heisman ceremony as a finalist. That's how talented they think he is. Georgia sees him returning kicks. They see him playing safety. They see him playing free safety. They see him playing corner. And Kirby Smart has wanted to make this recruiting process special for Terry and Arnold because he sees a lot of those things in him. And I've been doing this for more than a minute, Brandon. I don't remember a lot of top 5 DBs talking about Kirby telling them Jim Thorpe Award and Heisman's during the recruiting pitch.
I would say that's exactly true. It's a very interesting story. I hope folks read it for themselves at DawgNation.com. Jeff, we appreciate you being here on the road, assisted by AAA here today on our program. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll look forward to hearing from you, whatever may happen in the days to come when it comes to UGA recruiting. And, of course, chatting with you back here again on the road, assisted by AAA again next week as well.
Hey, Brandon, I hope you have a good weekend, and maybe there might be something that makes you smile coming down the track.
Look forward to the idea of that for sure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, a lot of reasons to smile today. Really feeling pretty good about it. I mean, listen, as we mentioned off the top of the program, or near the top of the program, the Keely Ringo news is a bummer. We hate that for him. And yet I have every reason to believe, much like a lot of Georgia players have recently, he'll fight back from injury. He'll be ready to go again. But overall, when you hear Kirby Smart talking about competition at practice, getting going on Monday, boy, it feels like football again. That's really fun to think about, and it was good to be on the road, assisted by AAA with Jeff Sintel here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Let's roll on now. Let's do our SEC through and deal with a couple of topics. I thought it was interesting to see from the College Football Playoff Selection Committee chairman after that group met again this week. Apparently the playoff is still on for now. There had been some question about this after 2 of the Power 5 conferences have decided they're not playing this fall. The Pac-12, the Big Ten, obviously sitting things out for right now, but ironically, the new committee chairman is the Iowa athletic director. Let me show you what he said upon meeting yesterday. He says, we don't know right now what the season's going to bring. This is Gary Barta, Iowa AD, College Football Playoff Committee chairman. He said, we don't know right now what the season's going to bring, but as a committee, we are ready to use the protocol and the expertise of the 13 people who've been charged with selecting the teams. The committee's task is to rank the teams based on what happens on the field. If the board and management committee say we are having a college football playoff, we will be ready. So obviously that doesn't confirm that it's going to take place, but they are still in a position, they say, to pick the 4 best teams, assuming that games are played. I still have some sneaking suspicions on this. First of all, the irony of Barta being an AD for a school that's not playing college football is a hint, an indication of that. But ultimately, the college football playoff, even though we, the average fan, think about this as being about competition, and that's probably good on the Barta quote there, but we think about this as being about competition, but it's really about money. I mean, the college football playoff is a business. We can take the Barta quote down now. It's really about money, right? And it's how the money gets shared. And with 40% of the Power 5 conferences not contributing to the pie this year, would they still be getting some of the money back out of the college football playoff? That feels like the kind of thing we would eventually have some tug-of-wars about one way or another. So I think there's still the chance to crown a national champion, and I think it's a legitimate season, even if you've got only 3 of the 5 Power 5 conferences playing. I still have my suspicions about a college football playoff, but I would not be against it happening if that's indeed the way that it goes down. Alabama Athletic Director Greg Byrne has spoken to reporters this week. We've heard a lot of enthusiasm from, like, say, Purdue coach Jeff Brom, for instance, on the possibility of a spring season. For whatever reason, the media just loves the idea of this spring season, even though a lot of former players have said they don't really view that to be a viable possibility. Greg Byrne, in terms of how the SEC has viewed this is what Byrne told reporters this week. Let me show you the Greg Byrne comments here, and we'll talk about this. So Byrne says there has been some, but not a ton, of discussions on a spring season. He says we're focused on our plans for this fall. Our goal is to play this fall. We've adjusted a lot since March, and we will continue to evolve and adjust as necessary. That's Alabama Athletic Director Greg Byrne on the possibility of a spring season, echoing what we think we would have assumed about the SEC anyway, that this is a league that just doesn't view that as all that, from all that enthusiastic of a standpoint. Ultimately, I don't believe the Big Ten is going to play this spring, nor do I believe the Pac-12 is going to play either. I just think that just seems like a virtual impossibility, something that's not going to go well. I think the Big Ten trying to maintain a 20-hour work week ahead of a season that they say may start sometime this winter, maybe not. I think ultimately that's the real problem, and that won't be covered. It won't be, there won't be a spotlight shine on that. But keeping players focused on the task at hand, keeping them healthy and safe in the midst of a coronavirus scenario on their campuses right now. Most Big Ten schools still having on-campus instruction, some of them trying to be something close to business as usual. I think that's going to be really hard for the Big Ten. Ultimately, I think the spring season myself is a little bit of a pipe dream, but nonetheless. By the way, speaking of the Pac-12, who also have made the decision to postpone for the fall season and have kind of been a little bit more outspoken about some of the specific reasons and why that happened. They've released some documents. Bruce Feldman had sources within the Pac-12. He wrote a story at The Athletic about why it was they decided to postpone their situation. Well, the Oregon State president, one of the schools there in the Pac-12, has, by the way, he's an LSU alumnus. His name's F. King Alexander. That's his name. So he was asked by the Oregonian, one of the newspapers that covers Oregon State, why it was the SEC was moving forward and, why it is the Pac-12 is postponing. And the quote here from F. King Alexander is they're not, he basically says, I think they're probably, he says, what did the SEC, anyway, he says they're just not dealing with reality. I'll give you a different quote that's easier to kind of put into context. He says, logistically and realistically, it's quite a gamble on their part, a big gamble. There are serious consequences if they lose. So F. King Alexander, the Oregon State president, is quoted by the Oregonian, says the SEC is not dealing with reality, that they're taking a big gamble here. I mean, when I wrote about the Justin Fields stuff at DawgNation.com this week, one of the things that I quoted was the Duke infectious disease expert that's at the head of the ACC's advisory board. He spoke to Sports Business Journal, and he laid it out, I thought, in very clear terms. That it is expensive to try to fight against this, but it is possible. That it's not easy, but it is possible. That over and over again, he laid out all the reasons why dealing with the coronavirus and also having a season would not be an easy thing to do. This is not a fairy tale. This isn't pie in the sky, just tell you what you want to hear. But he said that it was possible. And this is a guy with credentials. Listen, there are a lot of people, and I've even seen, some of this in recent days, who just sort of think that the Pac-12 schools in and of themselves are just better schools, smarter people running them. Therefore, they're going to make better decisions than some of what they would view as kind of, small-town backwater folks of the SEC. We've seen some mocking of Nebraska's insistence that a season could have been played because apparently they live in farmland. Apparently, if you live in a non-metropolitan area, you can't also be smart. We've seen some of that. Well, if you want to kind of turn your nose up, kind of the typical SEC school or whatever else, I mean, the ACC is being influenced here by someone from Duke University. And I have a hard time believing that the people who really, really value fancy pants private schools would somehow view Duke as anything other than right there in the same category of any other school you want to reference here. So you can say the SEC is in denial of reality, but the ACC right now is making similar decisions, and they've got very well-credentialed scientists who are going along with them on this journey and speaking out publicly about it, something I'm hearing some people say there isn't enough of right now. So, listen, this is a complicated situation, and we're going to hear a lot more in the days to come about why the Big Ten made the decision to postpone, why the Pac-12 made the decision to postpone, and what it is the SEC, ACC, and possibly Big 12 are saying about why it's okay for them to play. This conversation's far from over, and the challenges aren't going away anytime soon. That's the realistic appraisal. We'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, let me also mention for those of you getting ready to go back to school, Kroger's got some good stuff for you right now. Some of you, by the way, if you're in-person instruction, a lot of this, and this is true not just for like the elementary age kids, but also high school, college kids there as well. There's vaccinations you need to have taken care of, your TDAP, your meningitis, a whole lot more. Well, Kroger can get you taken care of on that, so you get all the paperwork you need to go to the school that you need to go to. Kroger.com vaccinations will give you everything you need on that. It's Kroger.com/vaccinations, and they'll take good care of you on that front. It's great to have Kroger as a part of what we're doing here on DawgNation Daily. Now, let me turn the conversation all the way back to something that's solely fun here just for right now. And that is something else that Kirby Smart said when he was on 680 The Fan yesterday. And this is something that Smart's kind of joking about this, but I have to admit, I am very curious about it. You know, one of the things that we have long since just, and I think rightly so, assumed is there is an advantage from playing at home. We call it home field advantage. And that's not just some superstition that, you know, home teams typically play well. I mean, in college basketball, home teams, it has been proven, get the lion's share of the close calls. That's been, or at least the majority of the close calls. There's been research done on that when it comes to officiating for home teams as opposed to away teams, at least in terms of college basketball. But what does Kirby Smart think about the potential home field advantage for a school like Alabama that at some point this season is going to host Georgia? Smart, kind of half serious, half kiddingly, spoke about that on 680 The Fan last night. I thought this was kind of interesting. Here's Kirby again.
Well, I know this. They still have a stereo system. They'll find a way to crank noise in there. I'm sure everybody in the SEC, you'll probably still have to have earmuffs without the crowd just because of the sound system. So the home team's going to find a way to make it an advantage. I can promise you that.
So listen, I do believe that if it's only 15,000, 20,000 at this point in time, that may be an ambitious projection, just given some of the conversation that's out there. But if it's only that small number of fans in a stadium built to hold 100,000, that's not enough to be loud. I just sort of believe that's true. Typically speaking, we've kind of thought of home field advantage as being worth in a place like college football, something in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 points. Gamblers know that, but you don't have to be a gambler to appreciate the fact that if you're playing at home, you almost start the scoreboard with a field goal that your opponent doesn't have. How much of that does change for this upcoming season? Kirby seems to think it's still a disadvantage playing at Alabama, but just how much of a disadvantage? That's one of those things that I'm not quite so sure that we know for sure as of just yet. But I am looking forward to kind of finding out more about that. At a certain point in time, I want to talk to some more of like the gambler types on that, because as I said before, NFL point spreads, college point spreads, they are very different, obviously, as they should be for the home team compared to the road team, or a game played on a neutral site. You're essentially giving that 3 points, that 4 points to a college team for playing at home, and I'm sure there's probably still an advantage for being at home. There is some travel, some comfort of being in the home locker room, stuff like that maybe. But how much does it change without the really loud crowds? We know the Georgia crowd, for instance, was a big impact in the Notre Dame game a year ago. The Georgia fans on the road that neutralized the Notre Dame crowd in 2017 kept that from being a home field advantage. That seemed to help Georgia a bit too. Kirby Smart has said that before. That's a really big unanswered question, for the season to come. I'm looking forward to finding out more about it. Gatorade Updater, 1,385 days. We'll see you Monday, DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down, and good to have all of you with us. And we'll take a lot of your comments on both Facebook and YouTube. We'll say hello to the Twitter folks there as well. And R.S. Andrews makes it all possible. Our buddy Dari, I was talking to our buddy here on the DawgNation side, BJ, about Dari here today. We got some fun stuff coming up with Dari this upcoming season, I believe. So we're looking forward to all of that. And we're looking forward to your comments here coming up. And don't forget, the hottest weather of the year is still yet to come. So make sure you get your system tuned back up to factory fresh specs if you're worried about your air conditioning going out. Prevent that from happening with my friends at R.S. Andrews. Find them online at rsandrews.com. They'll take good care of you. Now, I don't have my comments pulled up, so I got to do that real quick. Let me go to Facebook first, and it'll take a second to get there, but we will take your comments, and you can weigh in on anything. Kirby Smart's thoughts on the competition, what Jeff had to say about recruiting, or anything else. You can do that, and we will get going here. Lucy Bowers-Boykin checking in. David Johnson checking in. Always great to see all you guys and gals. Santiago Diarn says, if the season is totally canceled and everyone returns, what will the NCAA do for the 2021 class? 85 scholarship limit will be jacked up. It really will be jacked up. And, listen, I know they've, released some recent guidelines. I think you have a couple of problems here. when the spring sports happened and the NCAA tried to grant some extra years of eligibility, there were a lot of schools that didn't want to honor that because they couldn't afford the extra scholarships. Now, for SEC football, that's not an issue. But sometimes the accommodations that the NCAA makes for a lot of college football players, not the ones that we cover here, but for a lot of college football players, that won't benefit them anyway, because even if the NCAA allowed for additional scholarships, there are a lot of programs that say we can't afford these extra players. It's one of the reasons why I don't favor anything from Georgia, the SEC, that's NCAA wide, because I think the more you make things encompass the entirety of the country, the more you weaken your product, because there's just a lot of NCAA programs right now, a lot of conferences within the NCAA at the Group of 5 level, the FCS level, that I'm not quite so sure have a reason to exist, a justifiable reason to keep going, because when it comes to health and safety of their players, I don't trust them to be able to do that. When it comes to, even in normal times, peace times, if you will, being able to fully take care of their players, I don't trust their ability to be able to do that. I want the SEC to be separate from that as much as I can, because that means better things for the players at a place like Georgia and the other schools around the SEC. So that's the first thing to know about this, that even if they start granting, and by they I mean the NCAA, if they start granting additional eligibility, there's a very good chance that some schools would not be in a position to honor that or take care of that. But it's also a major, major complication. It just is. And people can pretend that it's not, or try to ignore that for right now. But at some point in time, there is some crazy, crazy stuff coming on that front. All right, let's see a couple other things here on the Facebook side. We'll go to YouTube after that. David Johnson says, win, lose, or tie, I'm a dog till I die. I like that. I can also remember back in the days when ties were a possibility. I totally agree with Robert Barnes that on both of his fronts there. Matt Rukavina says, here's what's going to happen this fall. We will play. Big Ten, Pac-10 won't, and they'll dispute the national title. They won't play a spring season because it'll cause too much chaos going into 2021. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I do think that's true. I mean, I think the most frustrating thing about the way in which, like, the Jeff Brom proposal has been put out there, and the way that some people have supported that is it really ruins two falls. I mean, maybe I would change my mind on this, and maybe y'all scream at me for saying this, but here's what my instinct. Let's say the SEC season got canceled this year, and you told me I could watch some version of football starting this winter, but that meant I also had to endure a shorter season in 2021. It's like my instinct would almost be to say, I don't want to ruin two falls just so I can play some bootleg version of the sport this winter and spring. Now, listen, I reserve the right to change my mind about that, because obviously I'd have withdrawals in a moment, and many of you probably disagree with that statement. But admittedly, that is my first instinct, and I would say that on behalf of the Big Ten too, that Jeff Brom's like, hey, all you got to do is play an 8-game season this spring and then a 10-game season next fall. But all of a sudden now you're talking about something that feels decidedly less than true college football in 2021 after no college football in the fall of 2020. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. So, I mean, I have to say I'm probably rooting against the idea of a spring season, because I don't want to see, another fall where all of this is kind of messed up. But maybe I'm just wrong for feeling that way, but that is my feeling. Mike Nash says, is the SEC schedule being released soon? The Texas A&M athletic director, Ross Bjork, did mention that it may come out next week. Does not expect it to be this week. I thought there was a chance it would be yesterday or today. Bjork seems to think it'll be next week. He told that to his in-house media at Texas A&M a little earlier this week. Philip Carroll says, thoughts on Ryan Davis earning some playing time. He was touted as an every down back that can play both inside and outside linebacker. Yeah, I mean, what I saw from Davis when he was healthy in high school was something I really liked. And I do think that, one way or another, maybe he's still battling some of that kind of stuff a little bit. But when healthy, I still believe that Ryan Trouble Davis is a guy that has a chance to make a major impact for Georgia. I do. And it is amazing. Joseph Kennedy is an example of this. Van West is an example of this. How many people, and I'm going to make an assumption about both Van and Joseph that's maybe wrong here, but people that are in favor of a fall season seem to just not think the spring season is really viable at all. Either it's not an enjoyable product, as as Van said, or just not something that can be done, like Joseph said. And I have to say I'm probably in that group too. I don't know what this means, but some of us get angry at how pessimistic others are about a fall season, and yet we turn around and we're just as pessimistic about a spring season. I'm not quite sure what that's about, but it is kind of interesting. Joel Moody on the subject of Channing Tindall. Yeah, Tindall's another one of these guys that I haven't quite given up on yet. I think that Tindall was, I'm just going to speak broadly here for a moment. In year one, it seemed like Tindall was a little bit ahead of Quay Walker. Those are two guys we've always kind of compared to each other. And last year, Walker may have been a little ahead of Tindall. That competition between those two and others may be far from done, but it does seem to me that Channing kind of popped first, had a couple sacks in his first year on campus. But last year, Quay Walker was probably the guy playing more and maybe playing a more dependable brand of football. So, yeah, it's an ongoing competition. Let me go over to YouTube just for a moment. And I hope you guys are getting ready for a great weekend. I am looking forward to that. Kids back in school the last couple of days. By the way, that has been a big thing. Talk about some tears yesterday. So I've been, for the most part, working from home, although I am coming in here to do the show now. If you want to go back to March, like our whole family's been in the same, house together. Me mostly working from home, with the exception of the couple hours that I come in here to the studio. Kids have been at home every day since then, throughout the summer, of course, and then throughout the online learning at the end of last year. But this week, back in-person instruction, me leaving in the morning to go to work. My wife, that has been a tough transition for her. So prayers out indeed. Noah Sheldon says, we have so many linebackers, I forget some of them even exist. It is crazy how deep it is. And listen, Georgia's no different than anybody else. They're not all going to pan out the way that you would think they could. But it is amazing how many options there are. There are just tons and tons of options. That's true. Oh, Lord. G. Grace already sending out some warning flares, saying, I just hope the Georgia fans can handle me the Monday after the UGA lost to Bama. Oh, boy. But, listen, I wouldn't expect it to be any different. G. Grace deserves to crow if he gets what he wants there. Georgia fans deserve the same thing. And here's what I like about Bama boy G. Grace, because he's been with us for years. I know he will be here if Georgia wins. I trust him on that. Our buddy Dennis Wilson, who sometimes comments on YouTube, if Georgia would ever play Miami and Georgia would win that game, I don't know if we'd see Dennis Wilson or not. We might. I just don't know. But G. Grace, Bama boy, is one of those guys that if Georgia does win against Alabama, whenever the game is played, Monday after the game, I trust that he'll be here on YouTube. Now, some of y'all other YouTubers may say different, but I trust G. Grace on that. He says he definitely will be here, which I would absolutely believe he would be. Nicholas King says, I hope we open with Bama and close with Florida. Yeah, so I made my case about this yesterday on Cover 4, presented by Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau, that if you told me there was any risk of the season being shut down, the one game I definitely want to see Georgia play is Florida. And a lot of Georgia fans did not agree with that. The one game they want to see Georgia play is Alabama. Now, listen, I hope Georgia plays all of them, so ultimately it's kind of an argument with distinctions that don't necessarily have a ton of differences. But the scenario you lay out is kind of an interesting one, that I believe it was Ross Bjork also who said that they were going to try to do some things when possible to preserve some of those end-of-season rivalries. Now, Georgia normally plays Florida like first Saturday in November, last Saturday in October, one of those two, depending on how the calendar falls. But this year, given there's no Georgia Tech, there's no Florida State, and if you want to keep the Iron Bowl as the final Saturday of the season, I wonder if you would play Georgia-Florida the last game of the year. The expectation is, and certainly the SEC's scheduling thus far has seemed to indicate they believe it's either Georgia or Florida to win the SEC East. They've been given very similar schedules, in other words. Would you want to make it kind of an all the marbles type game for the East there at the end of the year between these two clubs? I think it's interesting. Now, I have said that I think that Texas A&M will beat Florida, and maybe in a 9-game slate leading up to the Gators, maybe asking Georgia to go undefeated through that mark is not a very reasonable, realistic request either. So I guess if you put the game late, you're hoping that someone doesn't sustain the loss that diminishes the game between Georgia and Florida. But if they did schedule for the final Saturday of the season, it wasn't all the marbles, winner take all, SEC East. Even if there's no fans in the stands, or very few fans in the stands, I mean, you'd have to say it's about the biggest Georgia-Florida game we've seen, right? I mean, if it's the last game of the season, the winner goes 2 weeks later to the SEC championship, you'd have to call it that, wouldn't you? I mean, I think you would, no matter what the scenario around it is. Avian Curry says on YouTube that people in 1992 thought the SEC was crazy for having a championship game. This is a success during the crisis. Think of the stronghold we will have on college football moving forward. I think that Avian is quite correct on that. And one of the things I've always believed, and not everyone feels this way, I still think there's a lot of prestige in winning the SEC. For instance, let's say it was a regular 12-game season with a regular college football playoff. I don't view this as necessarily a national championship or bust year for Georgia. Eventually, there will be one of those. I'm not saying that's never going to occur, but I don't quite view that this year as necessarily being that. If this was a normal year, regular 12-game schedule, with Georgia ranked where it is, Bama ranked where it is, if Georgia found a way to win the SEC this year and still fell short of the national championship because Clemson was still just a little bit better, or maybe Ohio State was just a little bit better, or what, I'm just giving you possible scenarios. But if Georgia won the SEC and made the college football playoff, that's success. That's a validation of the early years, and we're still in the early years, of Kirby Smart as UGA coach. So as the YouTube commenter, Avian said, because the SEC championship has been built the way that it has been built and grown the way that it's grown, I still view it as an incredibly prestigious event. And the SEC championship for me still has some real importance. Georgia won the Rose Bowl at the end of the 2017 season, but that moment in Pasadena and making the national championship game didn't cause me to forget how cool it was to beat Auburn in the SEC championship. I just feel that way. If I had an SEC championship t-shirt, and I honestly don't know if I have one or not, but if I had one from 2017, I'd wear it. Back when I was much younger, in 2002, 2005, I wore those t-shirts. I was kind of proud of that. Even now, I do have SEC East, my own the East t-shirt. I wear that all the time. I still wear those things. And it's not, a consolation in comparison to the largest prize you can win, which is the national championship. But it's also not nothing either. I think there's room to kind of celebrate that. So I think it's a good point. Let's see what else is going on here. Oh, this is a good point. I should have mentioned this during the regular show. It always makes me so mad when I forget to mention something that I was going to talk about. But Jay Shipes brings up a good point. He says, Tennessee said they won't endorse any tailgates, but they will allow people to tailgate at their own risk. Maybe you read this different than I did, but that's not exactly the way that I read that from Tennessee. I believe that they have banned on-campus tailgating. So if you're looking at that as a template for the rest of the SEC, that's a significant loss to your tailgating square footage. Because think about a place like Georgia. If you're saying that you can only tailgate in university-owned property, then you're off North Campus at that point in time. You're off South Campus at that point in time. And if you're talking about going, north of North Campus, then you're getting into city-owned property, municipal parking lots, as a for instance, owned by the city of Athens. It stands to reason, especially given the fact that Athens is among the stricter towns when it comes to coronavirus policy, that if the campus is restricting tailgating at Georgia, the city will do the same thing. So all of a sudden now you've got to be in like a privately owned lot, someone's house, apartment complex, things like that. So maybe you read this differently than I did. The honest truth is I could have misread it, but I saw Tennessee ban on-campus tailgating, and I took that as a sign there'd likely be no tailgating whatsoever in most places around the SEC if that's the step that Tennessee was taking, which I kind of expected them to. That means that you've got to be, as I said before, at somebody's house, someone's apartment complex, something that's not university owned, not City of Athens owned if you want to tailgate. And that means that some people can have something that kind of feels like it. But if there's still a restriction of the number of people that can gather together, I would say Athens probably enforces that on game day. I really don't even know enough about the ordinances to know if it's 50 or if it's 10 or whatever it is. I honestly just don't know because I don't live in Athens partially. But if it's a small number of people in terms of what can be counted as a public gathering, I'd guess that Athens probably enforces that. And I would say around the rest of the SEC, kind of the same kind of thing. So Jay Shipe says they won't set up their own tailgating area, but won't stop people from wanting to set their own up. So maybe you're right about that. Jay, I certainly trust you on that. I saw the story, maybe just didn't read it carefully enough. Frank Patterson says, I missed the Gatorhater updater. I don't believe that I did. Now Eddie is faced the wrong way. You're right about that, because when I went to do, sometimes we get fancy around here and we kind of turn cameras for the guest interview, and when I turned today, I did turn Eddie in that direction too. But I think we kind of got the Gatorhater in just under the gun. Some days I'm talking a little too much at the end of the show, and we almost miss it, but I don't believe we missed that today. I don't think we did anyway. All right, a couple more. We got to get ready to go because it has gotten late. Noah Sheldon says, I did forget it today. I have forgotten it before, I'm ashamed to say. So it's only a possibility. Joel Moody says alcohol and social distancing don't coexist. I think that really is true. I don't think that's the reason why they've been banning the bars or restricting the bars, but it is kind of true that like one of the things that has always kind of made me a little nervous are close talk. If you've ever seen Seinfeld, you know the idea of that. I do feel like for whatever reason, alcohol makes people more of a close talker. There's a lot of leaning in, a lot of touching. Listen, I'm not anti-touch necessarily, but boy, there's a lot of close talking when alcohol gets heavily involved. I think that's probably true. Robert Barnes, this is actually a really good idea. It'd be nice if you had a place you could go, like a drive-in, where you could go watch the game and sit in your car. Yeah, I'd love to do something like that. And drive-in movies have gotten a lot more popular. There have even been some drive-in concerts as of late. The trick with the drive-in college football game is the TV rights holders kind of being, Ebenezer Scrooge about some of that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, it's a great idea. It's just a matter of, could you do that without the TV rights people complaining and trying to get every dollar bill that wasn't nailed to the floor? Todd Greer on the other side of the SEC championship, eliminating the possibility of multiple SEC teams making the playoff, and we've seen that be true before, for sure. All right, we've got to get ready to go. Keith Fold says the 1980 Georgia-Florida game was a very big one, and you're right about that, Keith, for sure. No doubt about that. Philip Jordan Wells says I'm right about the alky touching. Yeah, there's some of that. Richard Bright says the good thing about the alcohol, though, is it does kill the germs, and that's always a nice thing there as well. Very important to remember. We appreciate all of you being here for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down today. Let me also give a shout out to the AJC, always doing a good job of staying up to date on everything happening in your world. Atlanta News Now, you get that at AJC.com. We certainly appreciate that. And by the way, make sure you check out the AJC for everything happening right now. A lot of things to pay attention to, a lot going on. Big weekend preview, that's every weekend of the AJC.com. Continued coverage of how our state's battling the coronavirus. Important to be armed with the facts on that, and the AJC's done a good job of putting those out there. So find that online at AJC.com. Excuse me, get your Atlanta News Now at AJC.com. Also, big thanks to R.S. Andrews, making the R.S. Andrews Cool Down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. R.S. Andrews can do all of it for you. On the plumbing side of things, as of for instance, if your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day, but you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You have a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday, 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. I'll talk to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.